quiet eel rents of the Middle Ages. Tonight, we are going to talk about something very narrow, very strange, and somehow very ordinary. We are going to talk about eels, not dragons, not kings, not knights riding across a field in polished armor, not a plague sweeping through a city, not a siege, a crown, a battle standard, or a saint's vision. Just eels, long, slippery, river-dark eels, eels in baskets, eels in traps, eels in smokehouses, eels in monastery accounts, eels written down as rent, eels owed at Michaelmas, eels counted by the stick, eels carried through the damp roads of England in the Middle Ages as payment, food, obligation, and habit. It is a strange subject at first, but the longer we sit with it, the more it opens. Because an eel is not only an eel when it appears in the records of the Middle Ages. An eel can be dinner. An eel can be tax. An eel can be rent. An eel can be proof that a tenant has fulfilled an old duty. An eel can be a unit in an account book, sitting quietly beside grain, hens, eggs, cheese, Labor Days, coins, and other practical things. An eel can remind us that money was not always the only way people paid what they owed, and an eel can lead us slowly into the wet edges of the Middle Ages, into marshes and fens, into mill streams and river bends, into traps made from willow, into boats at dawn, into smoky kitchens during Lent, into abbeys that needed fish for fast days, into small tenants who knew that rent was not always silver. Sometimes rent had fins. So tonight, let us walk away from the castle hall and the battlefield. Let us go down to the water. The air is low and damp. The ground softens underfoot. Reeds move in the wind. A heron stands still in the shallows, looking like a monk who has taken a vow against excitement. Mist lies over the water. Somewhere beneath that dark surface, eels are moving. They are not graceful in the way a courtly poet would describe a swan. They are not splendid in the way a nobleman might praise a falcon. They are not useful in the obvious way of an ox or a horse. They are quiet, secretive, and difficult to understand. People in the Middle Ages did not know everything about them. For centuries, people puzzled over where eels came from. Their life cycle was mysterious. They appeared in rivers and marshes. They vanished. They wriggled through mud. They seemed almost to belong to the boundary between fish and serpent, water and earth, food and riddle. But if people did not fully understand eels, they understood one thing very well. Eels could be eaten, and because they could be eaten, they could be valued. And because they could be valued, they could be owed. That is where our story begins. In much of the Middle Ages, especially in rural England, rent was not always paid in coins. Coins existed, certainly. Markets used them. Lords wanted them. Kings taxed them. Merchants counted them. But in many local economies, payments in kind remained important. In kind means paid in goods or services rather than money. A tenant might owe grain. A tenant might owe hens. A tenant might owe eggs. A tenant might owe labor days in the Lord's fields. A tenant might owe honey, cheese, wood, fish, or a cartload of something at a particular time of year. And in watery places, where rivers and marshes gave up eels in great numbers, a tenant might owe eels. Not one eel as a symbolic gesture, not a decorative eel for a feast, sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands, sometimes more than seems reasonable to a modern mind. But to the people who lived with these arrangements, it was part of the order of things. If land gave grain, grain might be owed. If land gave pasture, animals might be owed. If water gave eels, eels might be owed. So imagine a tenant in the 11th or 12th century. He does not think of himself as living in an amusing footnote. He does not say, "One day people will find this odd." He simply has obligations. His father may have owed them. His neighbors may owe them. The manor court knows them. The Lord's reeve knows them. The abbey's steward knows them. The obligation sits in memory, custom, and record. At a certain time of year, the tenant must provide eels. That is all. The eel rent must be paid. To understand this, we need to understand the landscape. England in the Middle Ages was wetter in many places than it would later become. Before large-scale drainage, before many marshes and fens were changed by later engineering, there were broad, wet regions full of channels, pools, reeds, islands of drier ground, and shifting water. The fenlands of eastern England are especially important in this story. Places such as Ely were closely associated with eels. Even the name Ely is often linked with the eel-rich waters around it. This was not wasted land. To a person who only understands plowed fields, a marsh may seem useless. But to those who know how to live with it, wetland is wealth. It gives fish. It gives eels. It gives reeds for thatch and baskets. It gives wildfowl. It gives grazing at certain seasons. It gives peat or fuel in some regions. It gives routes by boat. It gives hiding places. It gives livelihoods that do not look like neat rows of wheat. The people of the fens and riverlands knew their waters. They knew where the bottom dropped. They knew where the reeds grew thick. They knew which channels were good after rain. They knew when water moved differently. They knew where eels were likely to pass. This knowledge was not written in Latin. It was held in hands, feet, eyes, weather sense, and habit. A man might learn it from his father. A woman might know it because she cleaned, salted, sold, cooked, and counted the catch. A child might learn by standing barefoot near a basket, being told not to touch something, and touching it anyway. Eels were caught with traps, nets, weirs, baskets, spears, hooks, and other local devices. A trap might be made from wicker, shaped to let the eel enter more easily than it could leave. Fish weirs could guide moving fish into places where they could be collected. Some were placed in rivers, some in tidal waters, some in marsh channels. Think of the craft involved: willow cut and bent, reeds gathered, a basket shaped by hands that know tension and gap, a trap placed where the water itself will do the work. The eel swims, the trap waits, the person returns later. This is not dramatic labor, but it is skilled labor. Many essential tasks in the Middle Ages were like that. Quiet, repetitive, precise, known best by those who did them. The eel catcher must know not only the trap, but the eel. Eels move especially at night. They like darkness, cover, and certain conditions of water. They may become active in wet weather. They can travel through shallow places. They can seem to appear where they were not expected. To people without modern biological knowledge, this added to their strangeness. A creature that slips through mud at night is bound to collect stories. But before it collects stories, it fills a pot. And in a world where food matters more than almost anything, filling a pot is no small thing. Eels are rich food, oily, filling, and useful on days when meat is forbidden. This matters because the Christian calendar shaped eating. In the Middle Ages, the year contained many fasting days and seasons when people were expected to abstain from meat. Lent was the great example, but there were also Fridays and other fasting periods. Fish became important not because everyone loved fish in a modern restaurant way, but because religious practice, food supply, and custom met on the plate. An eel was not meat in the forbidden sense. It was fish. That made it extremely useful. For monasteries, religious houses, and devout households, eels could help fill the long, meatless stretches of the year. A monastery had monks to feed, guests to receive, servants to support, workers to provide for, and obligations of hospitality. Fish ponds, fisheries, and eel rents were not quaint extras. They were part of institutional survival. Imagine an abbey kitchen in late winter. The air is cold. The floors are stone or packed earth. There are fires, pots, knives, boards, baskets, and the steady work of feeding many people under rule and schedule. The monks are not supposed to feast on roast beef during Lent, but they still need calories. They still need food that can be stored. They still need something to serve. Eels, preserved and counted, become practical. They can be smoked. They can be salted. They can be dried. They can be stored and carried. They can become part of the great quiet machinery of religious life. A monk might never catch an eel himself. He might simply see it arrive. A basket is carried in. The account is marked. The kitchen receives the goods. The cellarer, responsible for provisions, sees that the house is supplied. The eels become food, but before they are food, they are administration. That is one of the most beautifully dull things about the Middle Ages. Even slippery fish become paperwork. Let us imagine an account, not a dramatic manuscript with painted saints and gold leaf, just an account, a practical record, the kind of document made so that one person can know what another person owes, what has been received, what remains unpaid, and who should be mildly worried. In that record, a man's name may appear beside an obligation. So many eels, so much grain, so many hens, so many work days. The handwriting may be abbreviated. The Latin may be practical. The clerk may be cold, bored, and thinking about dinner. He is not trying to charm us 7 or 8 centuries later. He is trying to keep track. This is how the strange survives. Not because someone wrote, "Behold the astonishing eel economy," but because someone wrote down rent. The tenant owed eels. The lord expected eels. The clerk recorded eels. And now we are here, talking softly about them at night. This is one of the joys of small history. A king's coronation is meant to be remembered. A battle is meant to be chronicled. A treaty is meant to be copied. But eel rents survive because someone had to do accounting. The past often enters through the side door. Now let us follow the eel itself, not in its whole biological life, because that story is stranger than the people of the Middle Ages could have known, but in the human life it had after capture. An eel is taken from a trap. It writhes. It is difficult to hold. Its skin is smooth, muscular, and stubborn. Someone kills it, cleans it, and prepares it. If it is to be eaten soon, it may go into a pot, a pie, a stew, or be roasted, fried, or otherwise cooked according to local resources and taste. If it is to be paid as rent later, it must be preserved. This is important. When we hear that people paid rent in eels, we may imagine a tenant arriving with a sack of furious live eels, dumping them at the abbey gate like a nightmare from a fishmonger's bad dream. Sometimes live eels may have been moved, especially over short distances. But often, practical life required preservation. Salted eels, smoked eels, dried eels, food that could travel, food that could wait. The smell would have been strong but familiar. The work of preservation was part of ordinary life. Without refrigeration, people depended on salting, smoking, drying, pickling, fermenting, and careful storage. Meat, fish, cheese, grain, fruit, and vegetables all had to be managed across seasons. A household that could preserve food had a better chance of enduring scarcity. So the eel rent is not just a payment. It is a chain of labor. Trap making, fishing, killing, cleaning, salting, smoking, drying, bundling, counting, carrying, recording, storing, cooking, eating. A rent entry in a record may look small. Behind it stands a whole wet economy. Now let us return to the tenant. Day to pay rent approaches. Perhaps it is a customary date. Perhaps the obligation is tied to a feast day. The tenant knows the amount. Maybe he owes a small number. Maybe his holding owes a larger amount with others. Maybe the obligation is shared, inherited, or disputed. He has had months to know it was coming, which does not mean he is ready. People in every century understand this. A known bill is still a bill. He has caught what he could. He has preserved what he must. He has counted them. Counting eels sounds easy until one remembers that historical measures were often local, customary, and not always neat. Some records speak of sticks of eels, with a stick meaning a set number. Other payments are listed directly. Local practice mattered. Imagine eels bundled or strung in groups. Imagine a tenant counting under his breath. 23, 24, 25. Tie the stick. Begin again. This is not a coin purse. This is rent with a smell. He carries them, perhaps on foot, perhaps by cart, perhaps by boat if the water allows. The road is damp. The bundle is heavy. The eels are no longer alive, but they still announce themselves. A neighbor sees him and knows where he is going. There is nothing unusual in that. One man carries grain, another carries hens, another owes labor, another has eels. The manor runs on obligations. At the Lord's Hall or the Abbey storehouse, someone receives the rent. The eels are inspected, counted, perhaps argued over. Are these good eels? Are they too small? Are they properly preserved? Is the number complete? Did the tenant bring what was owed, or is he short? If short, will the balance be made later? Will a fine be imposed? Will the reeve remember? The eel rent is a practical transaction, but it also carries power. The tenant is not simply giving fish to a friend. He is acknowledging obligation. The lord, monastery, or estate receives not only food, but proof of authority. Custom says this is owed. The tenant has paid. The social order has repeated itself one more time. That is what rent does. It renews hierarchy. Quietly, annoyingly. Every year, now imagine the Abbey stores. The eels arrive with other payments. Sacks of grain, cheeses, birds, eggs, honey, wax, fish, perhaps small amounts of cash. All of it has to be managed. The cellarer or steward must know what is present and what is needed. A religious house could be a large economic organism. It owned lands, managed tenants, collected rents, fed people, entertained guests, gave alms, maintained buildings, bought goods, sold surplus, and planned for holy days. The monks prayed, but someone also counted fish. This is one of those grounding facts that saves us from making the past too misty. Behind every chant, there is a pantry. Behind every illuminated manuscript, there is a kitchen. Behind every abbey bell, someone is trying to make sure there will be enough food on Friday. The eel is part of that hidden support. It is not glamorous. It is useful. A useful thing can shape a civilization more quietly than a famous thing. Now, let us move into Lent. The season begins. Meat withdraws from many tables. Fish becomes more important. In a monastery, meals are regulated by rule, custom, status, and season. The exact diet varies by order, place, wealth, and period, but the pattern of fasting and abstinence matters. Eels, whether fresh or preserved, are one solution among many. The kitchen workers prepare them. Perhaps they cut them into pieces. Perhaps they stew them with herbs. Perhaps they bake them in a pie. Perhaps they serve them in a sauce that we would find unfamiliar. Spices, if available, depend on wealth. Monasteries and noble households might use imported spices. Poorer households rely more on local herbs, onions, leeks, garlic, ale, vinegar, or whatever is available. An eel in a peasant pot is different from an eel in an abbey feast. But it is the same animal. It slips across class boundaries in death. A poor man may eat eel because it is local and available. A monk may eat eel because meat is forbidden. A lord may eat eel because the estate received it in rent. A merchant may sell eel because urban people want cheap, filling food. A cook may curse eel because it is unpleasant to clean. The eel travels from river to rule, from marsh to manor, from trap to table. Now let us pause and think about how odd it is that the eel became countable wealth. Modern people often imagine money as neutral. It is paper, coin, number, bank entry, card swipe, or invisible transfer. We may dislike parting with it, but it usually does not smell. It does not rot if stored badly. It does not need salting. It does not wriggle away if neglected. But in the Middle Ages, wealth often had bodies. A cow could die. Grain could mold. Wine could sour. Cheese could spoil. Hens could stop laying. A horse could go lame. Eels could decay. Payment in kind required physical care. That meant economic life was tied directly to storage, season, transport, weather, pests, and skill. A silver coin could be hidden in a chest. A rent of eels had to be handled. This made the economy very material. It had weight. It had texture. It had odor. It had a place in the kitchen. A lord receiving eel rent was not simply becoming wealthier in an abstract sense. He was receiving food that had to be used, stored, redistributed, or sold. Imagine being rich in eels. This sounds funny, and it is a little funny, but it was also real. If an abbey received thousands of eels, that meant meals, obligations met, resources for fasting days, and perhaps goods that could be exchanged further. In a society where food security mattered deeply, stored food was power. Now let us travel to a market, perhaps in a town near a river. The morning is gray. Stalls are being set out. Fishmongers prepare their goods. There are baskets of fish, barrels, knives, wet boards, cloths, flies in warmer months, and customers who inspect everything with suspicion. Eels are present. Fresh eels, smoked eels, salted eels, or eel pies depending on place and time. The fishmonger knows how to praise them. Good and fat, fresh from the water, properly cured, good for Lent, good for supper, good for a household that cannot afford meat. A buyer asks the price. The fishmonger names it. The buyer objects because this is what buyers do. Another buyer squeezes too hard. A child stares at an eel and is told to stop. The market smells of river, salt, mud, smoke, bodies, bread, livestock, and human opinion. Eels are not exotic here. They are ordinary food. And ordinary food is often more historically important than feast food. We remember peacocks and swans because they appear in descriptions of elite banquets. But most lives were shaped more by bread, ale, pottage, cheese, onions, peas, beans, fish, and whatever could be stretched through a week. Eels belonged to that practical world. They were not merely strange. They were supper. Now let us go to Ely. Ely rises from fen country, associated with water, eels, and religious importance. The surrounding wet landscape helped shape its identity. The Isle of Ely was not an island in the sea, but an island-like rise in the fens, a place surrounded by watery land. It could be difficult to reach, defensible, distinctive, and rich in marsh resources. The name itself brings eels to mind. Imagine the cathedral or abbey rising above low, wet country. Imagine mist around the settlement. Imagine boats moving through channels. Imagine reeds cut and bundled. Imagine fish traps checked in the morning. Imagine people who understand water as other people understand roads. To live in such a place is to understand that land and water are not opposites. They mingle. Paths flood. Channels shift. Boats matter. A man may know a water route better than a dry road. A boy may learn to pole a small boat before he can read a psalm. A woman may judge weather by how the marsh smells at dawn. The eel is not a curiosity there. It is part of place, a name, a food, a rent, a livelihood. Now let us think of the eel trap again. It sits in water. The person who made it is not famous. No chronicler praises the angle of the weave. No royal seal confirms the excellence of the basket. Yet, if the trap is badly made, eels escape. If it is well made, the rent can be paid. The ordinary craftsperson sustains the economy. This is true everywhere in the Middle Ages. The blacksmith who repairs the hinge, the woman who brews the ale, the boy who scares birds from grain, the carter who hauls timber, the baker who keeps the oven at the right heat, the clerk who does not lose the account, the trap maker whose wicker holds. A civilization is not made only by rulers. It is made by competent people doing unglamorous tasks repeatedly. The eel rent reveals this. It is too small a subject for a grand epic, which is exactly why it is useful. It takes us closer to the actual texture of life. Now, because this is a slow narration, let us spend a moment with the eel itself in human imagination. Eels were mysterious. They did not show obvious eggs in the way people expected. Ancient and Middle Age writers proposed strange ideas about their generation. Some thought they arose from mud or from rubbing against rocks or from other natural processes that now sound odd. This was not stupidity. It was observation without the tools needed to see the full life cycle. When an animal hides its origins, people explain it with the world they have. The eel became a creature of uncertainty. It was fish, but serpent-like. It lived in water, but could move through wet ground. It was common, but strange. It was humble food, but valuable rent. This combination made it memorable. A salmon is noble in its leap. A herring is social in its shoal. A pike is predatory and sharp. An eel is secret. It belongs to the underside of things, to mud, to traps, to moonlit movement, to the quiet economy of people who live by water. There is something fitting about eel rents appearing in the records, almost sideways, not as a grand topic, just as an entry, a hidden animal in a hidden economy. Now let us return to the manor court. The manor court is where local obligations, disputes, transfers, fines, and customs might be recorded. Tenants appear. The lord's officials preside. People complain about boundaries, animals, debts, inheritance, broken rules, and duties owed. The language is formal, but the matters are earthy. A cow has wandered. A ditch has not been cleaned. A tenant has died. A widow claims rights. A son takes over land. A rent is unpaid. Someone owes eels. The court rolls preserve social life in compressed form. They are not warm documents, but they are alive if one reads patiently. For the tenant, the court is not history. It is trouble or order, or both. He stands with neighbors. He hears names called. He hopes not to be fined. If he owes eel rent and has not paid, the matter may be noted. If he has paid, perhaps it passes without drama. Again, the quietest outcome is often success. History notices failure. Life depends on boring completion. The eels arrive. The account balances. No one remembers the tenant's face. The system continues. Now imagine the lord's kitchen receiving the eels. A lord's household is not just a family. It is an institution. It includes servants, retainers, guests, workers, officials, and dependents. Feeding such a household requires planning. Food rents help sustain it. The household consumes the countryside, not in a cruel sense only, but in the literal sense that land, water, labor, and obligation flow toward the Lord's table. An eel served in the hall may carry with it the labor of a tenant whose name is not spoken. The Lord eats. The guest eats. The servant eats leftovers or a humbler portion. The tenant has already gone home. This is hierarchy made edible, but the system is not only extraction. It is also relationship, custom, protection in theory, obligation in both directions, and long habit. A lord who demands too much risks resentment. A tenant who refuses obligations risks penalty. The balance is uneven, but not always simple. Eel rent is a thread in that web. Now let us think of how one might transport a large eel payment. If eels are preserved, they may be packed. If the amount is large, a cart may be needed. If roads are poor, water transport may be easier. A boat moves quietly through a fen channel, low in the water. Bundles of smoked or salted eels lie under covering. A man poles the boat. Another sits behind him. Reeds scrape the sides. Birds lift away. The sky is pale. They are not adventurers. They are delivering rent. And yet this small boat is part of an economy that connects tenants, religious houses, landlords, markets, fasting rules, and written records. The Middle Ages are full of these small movements. A cart of firewood, a basket of eggs, a boy carrying letters, a woman bringing ale to market, a boat of eels. If you add up enough small movements, you get a world. Now, what did eels taste like? Descriptions vary, and modern taste depends on preparation. Eel is rich and oily. Smoked eel can be deeply savory. Stewed eel can be soft and heavy. For people doing hard labor, rich food was valuable. For fasting days, it could make abstinence less miserable. This is another little irony. Religious fasting was meant to discipline the body. But wealthy people could turn fish days into elaborate meals. Monasteries and noble households might serve fish in ways that were hardly austere. A poor person eating a plain eel stew and a wealthy person eating a well-spiced eel dish are both technically abstaining from meat, but their experiences are not the same. Rules are lived differently by class. This was true in the Middle Ages. It remains true. For the poor, a fast could be hunger. For the rich, it could be a menu adjustment. Still, eels helped many people observe the rules while staying fed. A practical holiness, if one wants to put it gently. Now let us talk about seasons. Eel catching was not random. The movement of eels through rivers and waters had seasonal patterns. People watched for those patterns. They knew when catches were likely. They prepared traps and weirs accordingly. Rent obligations may have been tied to periods when eels could be supplied or when preserved goods were due. The year in the Middle Ages was not a flat line of identical months. It was a wheel of tasks: plowing, sowing, lambing, calving, weeding, haymaking, harvest, thrashing, wood gathering, slaughter time, fasting seasons, feast days, rent days, market days, court days. And somewhere in that wheel, eel catching and eel payment had their place. To owe eels was to live by a calendar that included water. The tenant did not simply go to the store. He watched the season. He prepared the gear. He worked with what the river allowed. If the catch was poor, the rent still existed. A bad eel year could be a problem. Here again, obligation meets nature. The Lord's account may say one thing, the water may say another. The tenant stands between them. Now let us drift into an evening by the water. The sun has gone low. The reeds are dark at their bases. A man checks a trap. He lifts it carefully. Water pours out. Inside, eels twist. He tips them into a basket. They are alive and resistant. He mutters, because eels are not cooperative creatures. Nearby, a child watches with fascination and mild disgust. A dog keeps its distance. The man resets the trap. He knows the rent due. He knows what must be kept for the household and what must be owed. His wife at home knows how many can be eaten and how many cannot. That distinction is important. Not all food in a poor household is available food. Some of it is owed. A sack of grain may sit in the house, but part belongs to rent. A hen may lay eggs, but some are promised. A catch of eels may look like abundance, but obligation takes its share. The tenant's family may eat eels, but not all the eels they catch. This is one of the quiet tensions of the rural economy. What the land or water gives does not wholly belong to the hands that gather it. Now, at home, the eels are prepared. The household smells of smoke and fish. A knife scrapes. A pot heats. Salt is precious enough to matter. The work is messy. Children are told to stand back. The eels for rent are set apart. Perhaps they are hung to smoke, perhaps packed with salt, perhaps dried. The household eats a portion. This could be welcome food. It could also be tiresome food if too common. People can grow weary of what keeps them alive. Bread every day can be blessing and boredom. Eels may be the same. Still, supper is supper. Outside, the marsh darkens. Inside, the family eats. Tomorrow, there will be more work. Now let us consider why eel rents eventually faded. Over the centuries, as coinage became more available and economic systems changed, many food renders became less common. Lords and institutions often preferred money because it was more flexible. Coins do not rot. They can buy many things. They can pay wages. They can travel better than a barrel of fish. Wetlands also changed. Drainage, environmental shifts, river management, and later industrial changes altered eel habitats. Over the long run, eel abundance declined dramatically. The eel that was once common enough to serve as rent became, in modern times, far less common and more ecologically troubled. But in the Middle Ages, especially earlier on, eels were abundant enough to be ordinary. That is worth remembering. Rarity changes the way we see things. A modern person may see an eel as unusual, perhaps even unpleasant or exotic. A tenant in an eel-rich region might see it as food, duty, and nuisance. A monk might see it as dinner during Lent. A clerk might see it as an entry. A lord might see it as revenue. A child might see it as something funny and slippery. The eel's meaning depends on who is holding the basket. Now let us return to the strange scale of some payments. A few eels are easy to imagine. A dozen eels, still manageable. 100 eels, unpleasant but possible. Thousands of eels, now the mind slows down. Tens of thousands, and we are no longer thinking of a household basket. We are thinking of systems, fisheries, tenants, collection points, preservation, storage, accounting, distribution. Large eel rents remind us that the Middle Ages had complex economies. Not modern economies, but not simple barter worlds either. People tracked obligations carefully. Institutions managed resources across large estates. Food moved from rural producers to religious houses and lordly households. Records held memory beyond the lifespan of individuals. A man could die, his son could inherit the holding, and the eel rent could continue. Custom outlives the body. This is one of the heavy facts of the past. People are temporary. Obligations persist. Now imagine the son. His father owed eels. Now he owes eels. He may resent it. He may accept it. He may barely think of it as a question. The holding comes with duties. The water comes with labor. The Lord comes with claims. The account comes with ink. He learns the traps. He learns the rent day. He learns where to stand in court. He learns that life is made of inherited arrangements. The eel rent is not just fish. It is continuity. Now let us take a small detour into language. Words for payments, rents, renders, dues, fisheries, weirs, and local measures fill records. The language may be Latin, French, English, or a mixture depending on time and context. A clerk writing Latin may preserve an English word because no neat Latin equivalent fits the local thing. The result is a document that feels both official and earthy. This is one of the pleasures of reading old accounts. A grand language bends around a humble object. A Latin sentence makes room for an eel. The clerk may abbreviate. He may use conventional marks. He may not care about future readers. But somewhere in the line, the eel remains. A small animal crossing the border between water and text. Now, let us imagine a monastery receiving eel rent on a cold day. The gate opens. A tenant or carrier arrives. The porter speaks to him. Someone calls for the proper official. The goods are brought in. The eels are counted. A mark is made. Perhaps the tenant warms himself briefly. Perhaps he is given ale. Perhaps not. Monastic hospitality had rules, but not every transaction was warm. The tenant leaves. The abbey bell rings. The monks continue their hours of prayer. The kitchen continues its work. The eels go into storage. The account closes for the day. It is deeply uncinematic, which is why it is probably close to life. Most important systems do not look dramatic while operating. They look like someone checking a list. Now let us think about smell. The Middle Ages cannot be understood without smell. Smoke, damp wool, horse sweat, ale, bread, mud, tallow, garlic, manure, incense, fish, and in our case, eel. Fresh eel has the smell of water and flesh. Smoked eel has the smell of wood smoke and oil. Salted eel has the smell of preservation, sharp and dense. An abbey storehouse with fish rents would not smell like a modern office. Economic life was sensory. The person receiving rent did not look at a digital balance. He smelled the rent. He touched it. He saw whether it was sound or spoiled. He counted it with hands. That makes the past feel closer and farther away at the same time. Closer because bodies understand smell. farther because our own systems have hidden so much of it. Now let us return once more to the water at night. Eels move in darkness. A person who catches them must sometimes work near the edges of the day. The moon is behind clouds. The water is black. The reeds whisper. A trap is lifted. Something living twists inside. There is no need to make this more dramatic than it is. It is enough. The Middle Ages were full of work done under dim skies, milking before dawn, watching lambs at night, baking before sunrise, keeping a charcoal burn, guarding fields, catching eels. When we talk about history, we often talk about decisions, laws, and events. But much of human life is timing, knowing when to go to the water, knowing when to harvest, knowing when to salt, knowing when to pay, knowing when to keep quiet before a lord's official. The eel catcher knows timing. The eel does too, though not in a human way. Now, what of the people who did not catch eels, but ate them in towns? Urban demand mattered. Towns needed food constantly. London, especially, required enormous supply networks. Fish came from rivers, coasts, ponds, and trade routes. Eels from local waters, and from farther away could feed the city. Fishmongers, carriers, cooks, and household buyers all took part. A Londoner buying eel may not know the tenant who caught it. The city eats the countryside anonymously. A piece of eel in a pie might have passed through many hands, caught in a river, preserved, sold, carried, resold, cooked, served, eaten by someone who complains about the crust. This is a universal pattern. The more complex a society becomes, the less the eater knows the producer. Yet the connection remains. The eel is a small cord between marsh and market. Now let us imagine an eel pie. A pie in the Middle Ages might serve as container, dish, preservation method, or meal. Crusts varied. Some were meant more as cases than tender pastry. A rich filling could be enclosed and baked. Eel might be combined with other ingredients, depending on means and custom. The pie is cut. Steam rises. The smell is rich. Someone at the table is pleased. Someone else would rather have meat. A fasting day has rules. Rules produce creativity and complaint. The monk eats. The merchant eats. The servant eats if there is enough. The eel disappears into bodies, and the rent becomes energy. A man prays after the meal. Another man falls asleep. The account book remains. The eel is gone, but the obligation will return next year. That is the rhythm. Catch, preserve, pay, record, store, cook, eat, repeat. A very old rhythm. Now let us think about humor. It is impossible to talk about eel rent without some amusement. Paying rent in eels sounds absurd to us. There is no reason to pretend otherwise. A person imagining a landlord opening the door to thousands of eels is allowed to smile. But good history lets the smile settle into understanding. For people in a world with less cash and more local obligation, eel rent made sense. If the resource was abundant, valuable, and preservable. It could serve as payment. It is no stranger than rent in grain, no stranger than a tenant owing chickens, no stranger than taxes in wool. The only reason it feels funny is that eels are eels. They are not dignified animals. They do not stand nobly in a field. They do not cluck in a basket. They do not look like wealth. They look like something trying to escape. But history has no obligation to be dignified. Sometimes history is a barrel of smoked eels. Now, let us look at the decline of eel rent as a change in texture. When payments shift from goods to money, life becomes more flexible, but also more abstract. A tenant selling goods to get coin may have different worries than a tenant delivering goods directly. A lord receiving money can buy what he wants, but loses the immediate flow of local produce. Markets become more important. Cash obligations can be hard when prices move or crops fail. The movement from kind to cash is not simply progress. It changes relationships. If I owe you eels, you know something about my landscape. If I owe you silver, you know something about my market access. Both can burden me. Both can free me in different ways. The eel rent belongs to a world where place and payment are tied very closely. A watery holding owes watery wealth. A dry field owes grain. A household with hens owes eggs. A person's obligation grows out of the environment. That is one reason the subject is so quietly beautiful. It shows an economy rooted in mud. Now, let us consider the eel's journey in the natural world, though gently. European eels hatch far away in the ocean, drift as tiny transparent forms, enter coastal and inland waters, grow in rivers, lakes, and marshes, then eventually return to the sea to spawn. People in the Middle Ages did not know this full story. They experienced only the inland portion, the creature arriving and vanishing in ways that seemed mysterious. This means that eel rent depended on a vast natural cycle, invisible to the people using it. A monk eating eel in Lent did not know the Sargasso Sea. A tenant setting a trap did not know the oceanic route. A clerk writing an account did not know he was recording the end point of one of nature's strangest migrations. That is humbling. Human systems often rest on natural systems they only partly understand. The Middle Ages were no different. A rent entry may look human, legal, and local, but beneath it is water, migration, moon, mud, and sea. Now let us return to a single eel. It begins beyond the knowledge of the people who will eat it. It travels. It enters a river. It grows in darkness. It lives under banks, in weeds, in mud, in channels. It avoids some traps and enters another. It is caught. It becomes rent. It is counted by a tenant. It is carried to an abbey. It is marked in a book. It is stored. It is cooked on a fasting day. It is eaten by a monk who may be thinking more about the psalm than the fish. The eel's life becomes part of a human institution without ever understanding it. Most animals used by humans share this fate. The ox does not understand the plow. The sheep does not understand the wool market. The bee does not understand wax candles on an altar. The eel does not understand Lent. Yet human worlds are built from animal labor, animal bodies, and animal abundance. The eel rent makes that visible. Now let us think about bees for one moment, only because they make a useful comparison. Monasteries valued wax for candles. Wax came from bees. Candles lit altars. Honey sweetened food. A hive, like a fishery, could be part of an estate's resources. The Middle Ages worked through such living economies. Bees for wax, sheep for wool, cows for milk and hides, pigs for meat, hens for eggs, eels for fasting food and rent. The world was full of creatures drawn into obligation. A modern account may say assets. The older world might say cows, hives, ponds, woods, and eels. This is not quaint. It is concrete. Now we are nearing the quiet center of the narration. So let us place ourselves beside the fen water again. No one important is present. No bishop, no king, no famous knight. Only a tenant, a basket, a damp path, and an obligation. The tenant lifts the basket. It is heavy enough. He has counted twice. He does not want to be short. The morning is cold. His hands smell of fish and smoke. He walks toward the place of payment. Behind him, the water continues. The reeds move. More eels travel where he cannot see. His family will eat later. Some of the catch is gone. Some of the rent is paid. Life continues not because it is easy, but because tasks are completed in order. This is the kind of history that rarely becomes legend. No child asks for a bedtime story about the man who paid the eel rent correctly. And yet, perhaps we should, because most of civilization depends on correct, boring payment. The roof gets repaired because dues are collected. The monks eat because rents arrive. The records survive because clerks write. The tenant keeps his holding because obligations are met. Nothing spectacular happens. That is the point. Order is often dull when it works. Now let us imagine what happens if the eel rent is not paid. The tenant appears short. The official frowns. Perhaps the tenant explains that the water was poor this season. Perhaps a trap broke. Perhaps illness kept him from the marsh. Perhaps someone stole from his catch. Perhaps he is lying. The official has heard every explanation. A note is made. A fine may follow. The tenant may owe more later. Neighbors may hear. His reputation may be affected. In a small community, debt is not private. The unpaid eel becomes social trouble. It is almost comic, but not to him. Debt rarely feels comic from inside. This is another reason the topic matters. It reminds us that even strange obligations were serious to those who owed them. 1,000 eels may make us smile. A shortage of rent may have made a tenant afraid. Now let us talk about women in this eel economy. Records often name male tenants, officials, abbots, and lords, but women worked throughout the chain. Women helped process fish, preserve food, sell in markets, cook in households, manage small domestic economies, and sometimes held land or obligations themselves as widows or tenants. A widow might owe the same customary rent attached to a holding. A wife might be the person who actually knew how much food could be spared. In practical life, the household economy was not run by one person alone. The man may carry the rent. The woman may have salted it. The man may appear in the record. The woman may have made sure the household did not eat what was owed. This is common in the Middle Ages. Official visibility and practical importance are not the same. The eel rent, like bread, ale, wool, and dairy, passes through women's labor even when women are not named. So imagine the wife. She stands near the hearth. Smoke darkens the roof. She knows how many eels hang for rent. She knows how many are for supper. She knows whether the salt is running low. She knows whether the child has eaten enough. She knows her husband is anxious about the payment. She may say little, but the household survives because she knows quantities. Domestic arithmetic is history. Now let us place a child in the scene. Children in the Middle Ages learned by proximity. They watched work. They carried small things. They helped scare birds, gather fuel, tend animals, fetch water, mind younger children, and imitate adults. A child in an eel-rich village might know eels as part of the world before understanding rent, law, or lordship. The child sees the trap. The child sees the writhing catch. The child sees preservation. The child sees the father leave with the rent. The child hears adults speak of what is owed. One day, the child will owe something too. That is how custom enters the body, not as a lesson in a book, as repeated scenes. Now let us take the path from household to abbey one more time, very slowly. The tenant leaves. The bundle is secured. The path runs beside wet ground. The morning mist is lifting. He passes another man with a cart. They nod. No need for long talk. At a bend, he steps around a flooded patch. His shoes are already damp. A bird calls. He smells wood smoke from another cottage. The abbey bell rings in the distance. The sound arrives softened by mist. He keeps walking. This is a small pilgrimage of obligation. At the gate, he waits. Someone opens. The eels are taken. The count is made. His duty for this part of the year is complete. He turns back. The path home is lighter, not because the world has changed, because the burden is gone. For now, every rent paid contains that small relief. For now, what did the lord or abbey do with all these eels? Some were eaten directly. Some may have been stored. Some could be sold or exchanged. Some might supply dependent households or workers. Large institutions were not merely consumers. They were managers of resources. A monastery might receive goods from many estates and distribute them according to need, season, status, and opportunity. Food in the Middle Ages moved through hierarchy. The best portions might go to the high table, different portions to servants, alms to the poor, sales to markets, stores against future need. An eel could pass from rent to kitchen, from kitchen to table, from table to leftover, from leftover to servant, from servant to memory. The account says eels. Life says many meals. Now let us consider how this subject sounds. Eel rent. The phrase is short. It has a little bump in it. Eel rent. It sounds like a joke one might make in a tavern. Yet the phrase opens a door to environmental history, food history, religious practice, rural economy, legal obligation, and daily labor. That is why narrow topics are useful. A giant topic can become vague. The Middle Ages, kingship, feudalism, the church, war, all important but huge. An eel is small enough to hold, and once held, it slips through every part of society. That may be the most eel-like thing about it. Now let us mention feasting. Although eels were practical food, they could also appear in more elaborate meals. Rich households might prepare fish in sauces, pies, or dishes shaped by culinary fashion. Cookbooks from the later Middle Ages include many fish preparations, though recipes were generally for elite kitchens. Eels could be dressed up. The same creature that paid a rural rent could sit in a dish before a lord. This is another crossing of class. A peasant catches it. A clerk records it. A monk stores it. A cook transforms it. A lord eats it. A servant clears the dish. A dog hopes for scraps. The eel is upwardly mobile in the worst possible way. It rises through society by being eaten. Now let us return briefly to the modern strangeness. Today, many people rarely eat eel. Some know it through Japanese cuisine. Some know jellied eels as an old London dish. Some know eels mainly as unsettling animals in nature documentaries. In parts of the modern world, eel populations are endangered or threatened, and their old abundance is hard to imagine. This makes eel rent feel even stranger. But in the Middle Ages, abundance shaped normality. If a place had many eels, people used them. They used what was there. They built custom around it. Then records preserved the custom long after the environment changed. History is full of such ghosts. Old rents tell us what landscapes once gave. A rent of wax tells us about bees. A rent of fish tells us about water. A rent of grain tells us about fields. Rent of eels tells us about wetlands alive with movement. Now let us close the account book. The clerk has finished the entry. The ink dries. He may sprinkle sand or pounce to help dry it. He closes or rolls the document. He does not think about us. He does not imagine a future voice reading calmly about eels to people trying to sleep. He would probably find that very odd. He is concerned with accuracy. or at least enough accuracy to keep the steward satisfied. He puts the record away. Outside, someone carries another basket. Inside, the kitchen prepares for the next meal. The abbey bell rings. The cycle continues. Now we can let the day fade. The tenant has returned home. The water is darker. The traps are reset. The eels move unseen. In the cottage, smoke gathers near the roof. The family eats pottage. Perhaps a little eel remains for them. Perhaps not. A child asks whether the rent is paid. The father says yes. The mother says to finish eating. The child does not understand the relief in the room. Someday, perhaps, the child will. Outside, the marsh is breathing. Frogs call, birds settle. The wet ground cools. A thin mist forms. The river carries its own secrets. Somewhere below the surface, another eel moves through the weeds, unaware of rent, lent, abbeys, clerks, lords, tenants, markets, and all the strange human meanings waiting above the water. It is only an eel, but in the Middle Ages, that was enough. Enough to feed a monk. Enough to satisfy a landlord. Enough to appear in a record. Enough to carry memory through centuries. Enough for us to follow it quietly, from mud to manuscript, from trap to table, from obligation to supper. And now the village grows still. The abbey stores are closed. The account book rests. The traps wait in the water. The eels move under darkness. And the old economy sleeps, damp and patient, beneath the reeds. 1 https://historicartorum.org/eelrentsproject/udum source =chat. Com eelrentsproject.